Hi there, and welcome to my seminar on the impact of pornography on children and teenagers. For this seminar, pornography is going to be defined as material that is created for the purpose of being sexually arousing. Also, when I'm talking about children, I'm going to be talking about people from the age of 10 to 18. While children can certainly be exposed to pornography earlier than age 10, usually we find it's after 10 that they're exposed. So that's why I'm going from that age category. So as we look at this, we're going to be looking at several different areas. And first of all, we're going to be looking at some of the research that's been conducted around this issue. We'll be looking at counselor needs and assessments. We'll look at some of the ethical and legal issues. We'll look at oppression, discrimination, and the use of power. We'll look at counseling advocacy, and then we'll end with a biblical perspective. Before we look at specific research on the impact of pornography on children, let's look at some of the characteristics that children display that will have them respond differently. Not every child is going to respond the same way when they are exposed to pornography. So Flood in 2009 and then Crabb and Flood in 2021 took a look at what are some of the things that determine how a child responds when they're exposed to pornography. And they said that there's basically three different things that you want to look at when you're looking at this issue. First of all, is the characteristic of the child who's viewing the pornography. For example, the age of that child will have an impact. Parent involvement in that child, cultural background, home background, other personality characteristics, and current emotional state. All of that will have some impact on how the child responds. Also, the second thing they said is an influence is how that person engages in the content. What is their emotional, cognitive, sexual response when they see that pornography for the first time and then in additional times? And then the third thing, and this is really important to keep in mind, is the context of the exposure. So we find in research that most children, when they're exposed, it's accidental. Accidental is more than being intentional about it or having someone intentionally show you. But that's going to make a difference. The context is going to make a difference. As I'm going to talk about later, porn has been used to groom children and to get them ready for sexual abuse by perpetrators. So if a child is seeing porn in that type of environment, it's going to impact them differently than if they're just accidentally exposed by looking on a website or playing a video game. So we know that those three things make a difference in how a child responds. Let's take a look now at some of the impacts of pornography on children. One of the impacts of pornography on children is that it impacts their gender beliefs and their sexual scripts. So sexual scripts are things that they have in their mind, what they think about sex, what they think about gender. So viewing pornography influences what they're going to believe about sex and about gender roles and gender stereotypes. All of those things are going to be impacted. Specifically impacts objectification of women and the minimization of the importance of consent. That was found by Bernstein et al. In 2023. They surveyed 423 young adult college students between the ages of 17 and 25 through an online questionnaire. And they looked at the first exposure of those young adults to pornography, as well as what their sexual scripts are, specifically related to these items I just talked about. And they showed that there was a link between original exposure to pornography and their beliefs in sexuality and their gender scripts, with especially believing that women were objects and treating them like objects, or that consent didn't matter. We also know that exposure to pornography is linked to risky sexual behavior in older adolescence and young adulthood. There was a study conducted by Youngison and Setawan in 2021 where they looked specifically at this issue. They looked at the age of the first exposure to pornography, and then they linked that with, or they also looked at how addicted the person became to pornography, and they found that there was a significant relationship between the age of first exposure and between becoming addicted, with those who were exposed earlier in their lives more likely to have an addiction to pornography, which makes sense when we're going to talk about brain science in a little bit. The younger the age of first exposure, the greater the degree of pornography addiction and the greater the participation in risky sexual behavior. Most of the respondents in their study were actually between the ages of 12 and 15, and interestingly, they said that social media was the medium most used for their exposure to pornography. Those who were exposed younger than the age of 12 had even a higher risk of participating in risky sexual behavior as an older adolescent and young adult. Lin et al. In 2020 also surveyed some young adults and found through self-report that 50% of their respondents had been exposed to pornography by 8th grade, which is usually around the ages of 13 and 14 years old. And they found that early exposure predicted early the earlier age of their first sexual experience, as well as unsafe sexual practices and multiple sexual partners. Another study that was conducted, and this is in the business world, and a very interesting study actually by Mercham and Lewis Western in 2021, and it shows that pornography usage can lead to unethical behavior. So what they did was basically they brought in some people and they had some of them think about and describe in great detail the last pornographic thing they had viewed. So if someone hadn't been viewing pornography, they didn't think about that. But those people who had been viewing pornography were supposed to think about it and describe it in great detail. They then had these same people watch a video. It was a 10-minute video, a boring video. And then afterwards, they had them report whether or not they had watched the whole thing through. They found that those people who had been thinking about pornography were more likely than those people who were not to lie about whether or not they had watched the video all the way through. So there seems to be a connection or link there between unethical behavior and the viewing of pornography. We also know that pornography has a huge influence on the brain. Let's talk a little bit about brain science. So John Fovert in his book, Protecting Your Children from Internet Pornography, has a whole chapter dedicated to brain science and the research on this. But as a summary, basically what happens in the brain is that when a child is exposed to pornography, or when somebody is exposed to pornography, it releases chemicals, the chemical specifically dopamine, that makes you feel pleasure and want more. And so with a child who's exposed and sees that and has chemicals released that they might not even understand, these chemicals can be released, and the more they view, the more they want, because those neural pathways get stronger in the brain. And so it can lead to addiction. And we know that our brain's neuroplasticity, that our brains are malleable and our brains are forming, and especially that children and teenagers, their brains aren't even fully developed until they're 25 years old. So children and teenagers have this developing brain, and when pornography is introduced into a developing brain, it can lead to pathways that lead to addiction and other issues. So brain science is also a huge thing in dealing with the impact of pornography on children. It also can lead to mental health issues. The American College of Pediatrics in 2016 issued a statement that said that pornography use can lead to an increased rate of depression and anxiety in children, as well as acting out behaviors and aggression and the other things that I've already talked about earlier. So a study by Jones et al. In 2012 that is cited by Livingstone and Smith in 2014 stated that the children on their survey, they asked them how they felt, their emotional reaction to viewing porn, to seeing porn for the first time. And 50% of the children who responded said that they felt very upset when the first time they saw pornography. So it does have an emotional connection. It does have an emotional impact on children and on teenagers. Viewing porn, it can lead to depression and anxiety and other issues as well. It may also increase their vulnerability to sexual abuse and exploitation, which leads us into a discussion of oppression, discrimination, and the use of power. So let's talk about the connection between oppression, discrimination, and the use of power and pornography in children. First of all, as I mentioned, exposure of porn may increase a person's likelihood of becoming a victim of sexual abuse or of being exploited. There was a study of sexual abuse by Chimay et al. In 2021 where they surveyed sexual abuse survivors, and 40% of the people they surveyed mentioned that viewing pornography was how they were sexually abused or part of their sexual abuse. In fact, exposure to pornography or child viewing pornography is childhood sexual abuse. So an adult who exposes a child to pornography is abusing that child. This is definitely an issue of an abuse of power and of oppression of that child. Also, there was a study by Tomaszewicz and Cray in 2018 where they studied predictors of sexual victimization as well as predictors of sexual aggression. So the survey of young adults, and they asked questions about their sexual scripts, their cognitive thoughts about sex, also about their pornography use, and then they gave them scenarios to see how they would respond, to see if they would respond in a victim way, indicating victimization, or if they would respond in an aggressive way. And what they found was that there was a link between pornography usage and the likelihood of responding in a way that a victim would respond, or victimization. They also found that there was a link between pornography use and the likelihood that the person would respond in an aggressive manner, showing that there is a link between the two. Definitely an abuse of power that goes on in this situation. Crabb and Flood state that porn that has young women in it shows greater use of gender attitudes and aggression towards them. And it also shows them enjoying that. So when teens are watching pornography that has teens their own age in it, it's showing them that the teen likes to be aggressed against. So you can see again a case of oppression and misuse of power that goes on in this area. So let's talk about specific counseling needs for this population. First of all, before we really talk about some ideas for counseling needs, we need to keep in mind what we talked about earlier about how there's different things that determine how a child is going to respond to their exposure to pornography, specifically the characteristics of the child and the context. So a child who has the characteristics with lack of parental involvement, or even parents who are more on the abusive side, is going to respond differently than a child who has parents who are very involved and loving and concerned. Also, the context is very important here, because for a child who is exposed to pornography as part of a larger abuse system going on, or as grooming for abuse, that's going to be and require a deeper level of counseling than a child who's just exposed accidentally. Even though they both can have serious consequences, it's still different. So for the rest of this presentation, I'm focusing on the child who's exposed accidentally, not the one who has the context of abuse. So that's for some other time. So having said that, let's go now into some things and some ways that we can help those children, and specifically starting with helping the parents. The American Counseling Association in 2020 came out and said that it is the duty and responsibility of counselors to protect and advocate for the healthy development of all children, and that this includes teaching and helping train on the safe use of technology, as well as the negative impact on its improper use with children. I think that definitely the impact of technology and teaching kids to be digitally smart and teaching parents about that is part of the process of helping with the impact of pornography on children as well. And it's going to start, again, like I said, with educating parents. There was a study that was conducted by Davis et al. In 2021. And they did a qualitative study in Australia where the parents, and they interviewed them quite extensively between 2017 and 2018. And they interviewed them about pornography and pornography's effects, or their perceived idea of pornography's effects on children and on their children specifically, and other things that were along that line. What they found was that most of the parents in the study believed that pornography could be something that kids were viewing, but they did not believe that their own children were viewing it. They would often say things like, well, my child wouldn't be doing that, or they would tell me, they'd come and let me know, or they'd be upset when they saw it, they'd go, ew, and they'd turn it off, and I would know if they were viewing pornography. But we know from other studies that that's most likely not the case, because the high level of children who are being exposed and who are viewing pornography, it wouldn't match up. But in this case, we saw that parents think that their children are having an issue. And also, just as troubling, or maybe even more troubling, is that they didn't think that pornography was a serious issue, especially compared to the other issues of technology. So they didn't see it as something that really related, that they really need to have as a problem. So really helping with this issue is going to start with educating the parents, helping the parents to recognize that this is an issue, that pornography is aggressive and they're going to go after the kids, and they need to prepare their kids in advance for when the child sees pornography, so that the child knows what to do and how to respond, and knows that they can come to them as a safe person when they see pornography. So educating parents is really, really important. Zurcher in 2019 suggests that one way you can do this is helping parents build positive communities. So bringing together parents to talk about issues like this, to talk about technology, to teach skills, to talk about the impact of pornography and how they can help their kids who have been or are being exposed to pornography. So it made me think of group counseling. So counselors could perhaps offer group counseling that would educate and help parents as they navigate through this. Nathanson looked at the role of parents in helping children overcome porn. And he concluded that there are 5 different ways that parents can do this. So the 5 ways were controlling, which is basically done by the use of perhaps filters or putting limits on the amount of time, not giving your child a smartphone till they're a certain age, making the smartphones being turned at night. Anything that would kind of help control the flow of pornography into the house. Obviously, they can't do everything, but they can start there. So that was one of the ways that parents helped, through controlling. The second way that they helped was through modeling, which is really important because parents need to model for their children good technology use and what to do with that. If there's a parent who themselves is watching pornography, viewing pornography, it might be harder for them to help their child. So modeling is another way. A third way was building attachment with children. We already know that attachment is so important in so many ways with children. And there was another study that showed that those parents that were more authoritative and not permissive or authoritarian had better communication with their kids about this. So just building that attachment and that positive parenting style can help in this issue. Another thing is building understanding of the dangers of porn, both for the parents and the parents then helping their children understand the dangers of porn. Not just stay away from it, but why they should stay away from it. Sharing a lot of the information that's already been shared in this presentation would be helpful. And then providing supporting activities or something different to do. So something that the child can do instead of watching porn or instead of doing things that might make them become more susceptible to it. Providing those healthy activities, sports activities, family activities, clubs, things like that that can help them in that way. So those are 5 different things that we can teach parents to do and how to help in that way as well. Gibbons et al. Had some really good ideas of how a counselor can help somebody who's addicted to pornography. Now, we're not always talking about addiction yet when we're talking about children, but a lot of the things that they said is really applicable to working with children as well who are dealing with pornography. So one of the things that they mentioned is that the counselor needs to look closely at his own relationship with pornography. And that is obviously a very important thing for counselors to do with anything. Look at their relationship with whatever issue it is. But in the issue of pornography, what's their relationship with that? And really come to terms with that before they can help the person, the child who's struggling with it. Also, they said, look at the system. Is there poor family functioning? What's going on there? And try to encourage and help the system as a whole. And help the client deal with shame. This, I think, is so important with children because they might, when they look at it, they might think, wow, I am a bad person because I looked at that. And that can really come inside and they can internalize that and that can carry on with them into adulthood. So helping the child deal with those feelings of shame, normalizing the issue and helping them to realize that, yeah, porn is a bad thing, but you're not a bad person because you saw it. Helping them with that. And also mention looking for anger and blame that the child might have. The child might come across as angry, or as we're going to talk about in a few minutes, as anxious or depressed. But it might actually be because of this pornography they're seeing. So looking at that and teaching self-compassion to both the child and the parent, teaching the parent empathy and to have compassion on themselves because the parent might feel bad. The parent might feel responsible that the child has seen it, that the child was exposed in the first place. So you might have to deal with that. And then also the parent might need to feel empathy towards the child. It's really easy to want to come out as a parent and say, no, don't do that. That's terrible, and punish the child when they need empathy and need to be able to walk alongside them to help them learn self-compassion, to help them set realistic goals. And this is another way that counselors can help. They can set realistic goals for the entire family. They can involve psychoeducation, which we've talked about a little bit, but also psychoeducation that includes emotional awareness, self-regulation, and contingency planning. What do I do if I see pornography again? What am I going to do? What are my triggers? How can I avoid those triggers so that I don't get involved with pornography again? And Fober in his book mentions that parents might also need help talking to their young clients about sex. So counselors might actually have to become sex educators for their children and their teen clients to help them combat the messages that they're getting from pornography. And one other way that counselors can help parents in this issue and children in this issue is by helping parents to have a framework for how to talk to their children about pornography before it happens. We really want to focus on the prevention aspect of it because children are exposed to pornography so young. It's important to get them and to talk to them about it before their first exposure. So we're talking about before 10 years old. Defend Young Minds is an organization that has resources for parents to use in talking with children about this. One of the things they have is a picture book called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, and they have 2 versions of it. One that's for very, very little children, like toddlers and preschoolers, and then one that's for children who are a little bit older. And it gives a framework. It's something counselors can use as well to help parents, to help children, so that they know what to do when they're exposed. And they suggest 3 different things to do. They suggest the first thing you need to do is define it. Young children don't even know what pornography is. So to give them a definition of pornography in language they can understand, and to help them so that they know what it is when they see it. So they know that it's not something they should look at, so they know what it does to them, how it can be harmful, and to help them know ahead of time. So giving them that definition, giving them that education ahead of time is very important. So we define what pornography is, and then we warn them. We give them how it can harm them. We give them the information in a child in their age-appropriate way of what it can do to them. And then we give them a plan of what to do when they see it for the first time so that it's not a surprise. So they're not just looking, scrolling, or playing a video game. Something comes on and like, oh, what's that? And they start clicking and seeing more and more and more and more. But instead, they know what to do. So that when they see a picture, they can say, oh, that's what my mom was talking about, or that's what my counselor was talking about when they were talking about pornography. I know what to do now. It can hurt me. I'm going to turn off my computer or shut down my system, my game, and I'm going to go tell somebody about it. And then they have something they can do. They have a framework for how they can deal with it. So that's a way that we can help parents to prepare their children to help prevent, or at least prevent the really negative things that can happen when a child is exposed to pornography. As far as specific counseling techniques, if you are interested, I want to recommend this book. It's called Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, Guidebook for Counseling Kids. It's written by the author of Good Pictures, Bad Pictures that I talked about in this seminar. And she's a licensed professional counselor. And she just gives some really good interventions to use with children who have been exposed to pornography. It talks about what to use with children who have trauma in their background versus children who have just been exposed and need some help working through that. So I recommend this book very much to have, especially if you're going to be working with children. Let's talk about assessment in this area. First of all, like with any good counseling, you're going to want to do an assessment of the biological symptoms. You're going to want to do an assessment of their thoughts and feelings, family interaction, peer culture dynamics, their religion, all of those things to get a clearer picture of the client. You're also going to want to get an understanding of how the first exposure came about. What was the onset of it? What were the conditions that were around at that time? What happened, the context? How was the response of the family, the response of the parents? What are the triggers? And what are some other mental health issues that might be there? How does the child, if the child is continuing to view pornography, how? Where are they seeing it at? What are they doing? What are they doing at the same time if they're watching porn? What are their sexual behaviors? What are their expectations? What are their beliefs? All of those things. And then look for the clients that present with anxiety or depression, or that are impulsive or obsessive compulsive. Filbert suggests looking at the possibility of porn use with anybody who presents with anxiety and depression, especially in children. So maybe using a depression screener like the PHQ-9 for teenagers, or an anxiety screener to see if they have any of that going on, and then to kind of, if they test high there, to kind of ask about the pornography use at that time. There's also a screening tool called the Youth Pornography Addiction Screening Tool, which measures youth pornography addiction and online pornography usage, which could be helpful in looking at more the behaviors of the child and the teenager after that first exposure, and if there is an addiction that has occurred and further counseling is needed in that area. Let's talk briefly about some of the legal, ethical, and multicultural issues surrounding the impact of pornography on children. First of all, it's really hard to get any good studies that show the impact of pornography on children, because introducing a child to pornography is unethical and illegal and abuse. So a lot of the studies that we have actually are based on young adults or on their self-report of what occurred to them as children when they had their first exposure. And so as a self-report, it might not always be entirely accurate. There's very few, if any, longitudinal studies on this issue, so it's hard to get the research in there. However, because we do know from research that our sexual scripts are developed early in life, we can understand, we can conclude that the sexual scripts and the ideas of young adults were established earlier in life. So we can kind of generalize and say that the impact that we're seeing on young adults impacts children, and I would say impacts children even more because of their brain and how their brain is developing. Another legal issue is, again, we're dealing with children. So you have to be really, really clear about informed consent and about what is confidential and what you have to report and why. And you also have to make sure that you do the reporting that you need to do, because in some cases, if they're exposed to pornography by an adult, that is abuse. So you have the legal issues going on there. And as far as multicultural counseling considerations, there has not been a lot of studies conducted on different groups and on the impact of different cultural groups and how that impacts this. So that is a consideration to keep in mind, what the culture says and what the culture, how they respond to pornography and what they feel about pornography. And all of that could have an impact as well on how children respond. Counseling related advocacy and social justice is a huge thing for this issue. So education is important, and treating this issue as a public health issue, which it is when you think about all of the ways that it can impact children and the fact that it can be considered abuse, it is a public health issue. So framing it that way and then speaking into it as a counselor, as an expert in the area in any different situation that you get an opportunity to do, can be a valuable way of advocating for this issue and for this group, for the children who are being impacted by it. Counselors can advocate in several ways, like in passage of legislation that protects children or that makes it more difficult for pornography to be accessed online, looking at putting in limitations for internet service providers and things like that. Speaking out in that arena can be very important as well. Counselors can also educate people on the importance of educating children and adolescents about this issue, possibly looking at sexual education curriculum, or even being providers of that in school, making yourself available to go into schools and to talk to kids about the impact of pornography and help in the prevention area is a really great way that counselors can become involved in this issue. Let's close this seminar with a discussion on biblical foundations and how that relates to the issue of pornography and children and teenagers. First of all, when we're talking about pornography and we're talking about sexuality, and we know when we talk to our kids about this, we can talk to them in a way that frames sexuality in the way that it was meant to be. God created man and woman for a sexual relationship. He created the sexual relationship between the two of them. In fact, when did sex enter the scene? Was it before or after the fall? Sex came in before the fall. So it was created in that perfect environment. And in a perfect environment, it would be great. But we know that, like everything, sex was impacted by the fall, that sin impacted it. And part of the impact of it was pornography. So teaching kids that sex is a good thing when used within the proper way that it's supposed to be used, the way that God designed it to be, is a great way to start in educating children and talking about the impact of pornography. Because then you can go and you can talk about how pornography is a distortion of God's beauty that he created. And it's a distortion of that image of God in us. And it's also treating people less than the image of God because they're created in the image of God. So we want to make sure that we always are doing things to treat them according to the value that they have. Talking with kids about how they are wonderfully made. Their bodies are beautiful and wonderful. And looking at things like pornography cheapens that wonderful, beautiful part that we are, the way that we're created. So giving them that foundation and showing them how pornography actually makes a mockery of God's creation. Tim Challis talks about this in his book that's designed and written for parents and helping parents talk to their kids about pornography. And he talks about how porn does make a mockery of sex and of God's design for sex, and about how porn, like sin, is progressive. So you start with just one little thing, and then before too long, you're watching another and another and another, and it's progressive. Proverbs 27:20 talks about this, how sin just always wants more. And it's the same thing with pornography. So teaching the children, Challis also mentions the importance of talking to our children, modeling for our children, and then praying for our children. Understanding that God loves them, that God doesn't want anything to happen to them. The Bible says that sin is going to come into the lives of children, but woe to the person through whom that sin enters. That person, it would be better for them to have a millstone tied around their neck and to be thrown into the bottom of the sea because they caused a little one to stumble. And when children are exposed to pornography, they are being exposed to that sin and they're being caused to stumble. I believe that those verses in the book of Matthew speak very relevantly into the issue of the impact on pornography on children. Weiss and Glaser, in their book that they wrote in 2021, said that our best shot at helping our teens come through the challenge of adolescence as men and women who rightly cherish the goodness of sex is to become parents who ourselves have rediscovered, embraced, and shared with them God's plan and purpose for it. And I think we can put counselors in there as well. So we have gone through we've dealt with our own baggage, and we understand what God's purpose for sex was. And so we're going to share that with our clients and help them come to that understanding and to embrace that understanding, to understand God's plan and God's purpose for sexuality and how we can get closer to that plan and that purpose through Him and through His grace.